You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, and with me, as always, my partner in crime. You know him, you love him, as the lead NFL writer for Heavy.com. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, as we come to our listeners here from the Vivid Seats studio a day after that unfortunate meltdown, I guess we can call it, the Broncos squandered a 14-point lead, completely fell apart, allowed the Jacksonville Jaguars to run roughshod over him in the run game. I don't know. I think Leonard Fournette's still running through Denver right now. How are you feeling today, bro?
I'm feeling all right. I'm kind of, from a Broncos, I guess, putting on my Broncos fan hat. I'm picking up the pieces and kind of surveying this team and coming to grips with the fact that they're not a good football team. They have some positive pieces there. They have some glimpses of hope for the future. But as of right now, at 0-4 and having just lost their best young player on defense or young player overall, it's just an abysmal season. You got to just face facts. Sometimes you have to look in the mirror and just own how bad things are instead of trying to always be in denial and delude yourself into thinking something's positive. If you just tell yourself the Broncos are a bad football team right now, whatever happens between now and December, January, you will not be surprised with.
And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the Broncos get clobbered with a 2x4 Monday morning with the news breaking that Bradley Chubb, in fact, tore his ACL in Week 4 against the Jacksonville Jaguars and is done for the season. A partial tear, but done for the season nevertheless. Zack, we're going to analyze the aftermath, where to go from here, what that means for the Denver Broncos. We're going to talk about some Chris Harris stuff that's come out since the fourth loss of the season. But first, a couple of quick matters of business. You guys make sure you're following the show on Twitter, @HuddleUpPod. Why? That's how you stay plugged in. That's how you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the show in real time. Go to Twitter, follow @HuddleUpPod, and make sure you're leaving a creative review and a 5-star rating if you like what you hear over on Apple Podcasts. It's a phenomenal, easy, organic way that you can help support the show. It goes a long way towards helping Zack and myself and Nick and Carl and Eric and Lance. You guys have no idea. Plus, what it does is when you make post a review, it puts you in the running for the swag giveaway each month, so take care of that.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zack, let's talk about this. The news initially broke by Adam Schefter that Chubb tore his ACL, done for the season. Literally less than 10 minutes later, Fangio's at the podium, confirms, yep, he's done. Where do the Broncos go from here with regard to how this impacts the Chubb injury, this defense?
I guess next man up is Malik Reed, and that's the only place they can go. They're going to have some Justin Hollins in there, and they're going to do what they can to get by. But it's not just the on-field production you're losing. It's the morale in the locker room. He was such an ascending player. He was a perennial all-pro type talent. He was coming on to have career highs in tackles this year and tackles for losses, quarterback hits. And it's just to come out of that, playing through a torn ACL in that game and then having to miss the season after it. It's just a gut shot, and I feel so bad. Not necessarily for Denver's defense, more so for Chubb, because he was really blossoming into a household superstar, and all this is going to do now is set that back till next year. So I feel brutal for him right now.
What really worries me is something that Fangio touched on more in passing when he was asked what type of loss this is. He said, quote, "It's a huge loss. He's one of our better players, obviously. He's a tempo setter," and I want to underline that here. He's a tempo setter, a great player, a great person, a leader, and all that. So it is a loss, close quote. That's been one of the biggest things here, Zack, we've seen the Broncos struggle with is, tempo, intensity, physicality, and maintaining those levels consistently for 60 minutes. And Chubb's one of those guys who is an example of how to do that. He sets the tone. Anytime he's on the field, he goes 100%. Doesn't mean he wins every rep, but more often than not, we all know he does. And that type of leadership by example and that fiery intensity that he does have on the field, that's gone. And for a guy like Malik Reed, as encouraging as his performance was yesterday, to tally his first career sack and help the Broncos get on the board and continue to break that ice in terms of not having sacks going into the game, he's still a rookie, an undrafted rookie at that. He's still going to be swimming. He's still going to be going through a massive trial and error learning curve. And in that sense, he's not going to be able to have that same type of emotional impact. He's not a top 5 pick. He's not someone that other players necessarily are going to be looking to as any type of, model or, for any type of leadership. So that's the biggest thing that worries me.
I realize I didn't answer the question as it pertains to the actual defense. It's going to hurt them, obviously, for their pass rushing component, but in run defense, that's where Chubb silently and underratedly kind of moved up the ranks, and he worked on that from last year. He was very stout against the run this year, and obviously it's going to hurt Von Miller, who struggled to get going for the first 4 weeks. Now he's going to face more double teams, more chip blocks, more attention without having Chubb on the other side of him. So obviously, to the Broncos defense, it's a massive, irreplaceable hole being left behind by Bradley Chubb. The only glimmer of hope is that it gives young players like Reed and Justin Hollins the chance to step up, and the Broncos can know what they have in them. They know if they have either backup types or potential starters or maybe even potential replacements for Von Miller, all the trade rumors circulating there. That is the only positive, though, Chad, about this injury. It just sucks all around. But I guess I'm excited to see the young players, especially Malik Reed, who's really been consistently performing well in the Vic Fangio defense. A rare player that's succeeding in this defense.
It was somewhat disheartening for me to hear what I'm about to say, but at the same time, we probably shouldn't have expected anything less, because the Broncos don't exactly have a proven number 3 in terms of behind Von Miller, behind Bradley Chubb. But when he was asked how they're going to handle this, is Malik Reed kind of the next man up, etc., he used the committee word as how the Broncos are going to react. It's going to be a committee. Malik Reed, it's going to be Justin Hollins. Let me tell you guys something. Now, Justin Hollins, he was a 5th-round pick. He's got a lot of talent. He's got length. He's got freakish ability. But if you watched him out on the field on Sunday against the Jaguars, he was a straight-up liability. In fact, Eric Trickle had a great article in his grades piece that he does each and every week. He highlighted Justin Hollins, who has earned the single lowest grade of any Bronco this year, single game. He gave up 2 of those 2 touchdowns in the second half that gave the Jaguars all that momentum and the lead. That was at the hands of Justin Hollins, basically. And so I know that playing edge, he's not going to be in coverage as much, but what that showed me, Zach, is that he's still swimming. He's not ready for the speed of the game. He still needs time to learn and settle in. I'm hoping it's mostly Malik Reed, and maybe I'm getting back on the phone. I don't know what happened to Dakota Watson, but I'm seeing if maybe he wants to come back.
It's a great point about Hollins, and I think part of the reason why he's swimming is because he's had to learn 2 positions, playing inside and outside. The committee approach probably works best. I know it's hindsight, but man, how clutch would Shaquille Barrett be right now? I mean, leading the NFL in sacks, just dominating every single game. I understand why the Broncos moved on, but to have that guy as your backup for a couple years behind Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware, that was pretty special. I don't know any free agent. I'm thinking off the top of my head, maybe Jeff Holland. They can bring him back. I know he was released by the Bills, but he wasn't showing too well. I think the Broncos are just going to have to suck it up and roll with the players they have. I agree with you. It's going to be mostly, I think, Malik Reed with a lot of Holland sprinkled in there as well.
Well, the thing that fans have to remember is the Broncos have been spoiled at the edge rusher position dating back to 2011. When Vaughn was drafted, you had Elvis Dumervil and Von Miller for 2 years. That was followed up by DeMarcus Ware and Von Miller for a 3-year period. Then that was followed up not long after with basically, I know there was a year or so in between 2017 anyway, 1 year without Chubb, but then Chubb arrives. You got Chubb and Vaughn manning the edge. Most teams are lucky to have even one dominant edge rusher. And so the silver lining is at least the Broncos still have Von Miller. I don't think, and we'll talk more about this later on in the show, Zach, the topic of putting guys on the trading block, facing facts, let's rebuild, let's build draft capital, let's move this thing forward. 2019 is a bust, and let's look to the future. Von Miller might have been a topic, an uncomfortable possibility to consider listening to offers for yesterday. But in the wake of the Bradley Chubb injury this year, I don't think that's even something the Broncos slightly even entertain at this point.
Yeah, I don't even think it was a possibility regardless of Chubb until next offseason. But now, for sure, I mean, he's the guy now. And honestly, I think he will secretly like this Von Miller. He will never publicly come out and say this, but I think he was kind of irked at the fact of how much spotlight Chubb was taken from him and how much praise he was getting from Vic Fangio, whereas Fangio kind of chided, Miller the whole offseason. I'm willing to bet secretly he's a little more contented now, Von Miller, and I don't think he's going to make many waves. He'll play out this season like a lot of other veterans, and the Broncos will explore their options next offseason when they can.
All right, so Terrible news on the Bradley Chubb front. And I guess the silver lining for him is he no longer has to suffer through these depredations that his 52 other teammates have to, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, he gets to chill on the couch now, sit back and watch the Broncos on TV and not have to kill himself to play through a loss. He could just see it on TV.
Go in for treatment, every day, get in his rehab after the swelling subsides, and, better luck next year type thing. But Bradley Chubb will return. Fortunately, he's still young and he'll bounce back. He's a great ascending young player, which makes this all the more tragic. But the Broncos still have some big fish to fry and some major questions that are unanswered. And Zach, one thing that we need to address here is after the game, two things. All right. Number one, Chris Harris Jr. All right. He is quoted by, I think it was Mark Kisla of the Denver Post, and I'll paraphrase it here, something to the effect of, I've only got 13 weeks left. I've only got 13 weeks left of this BS, and then I'm out of here, right? I'm hitting the open waters of free agency, and I'm hightailing it out of the Mile High City. On the heels of that, he published a tweet, and Zach, I really thought that your quote tweet in response to it was appropriate. And let me just read to listeners what Harris said. Quote, on Twitter, "I love being a Bronco, and the only thing I am unhappy about is losing. Anyone who suggests otherwise is flat out wrong. Hashtag strap Harris." Zach's response, agent speak, right?
1,000%.
Elaborate on that for our listeners.
I mean, if you go and compare, and this is not a personal shot at Chris Harris Jr., but go look at his other tweets. He does not write like that. He does not compose a sentence like that. It just sounds like something his agent would write. I would wager that his agent actually wrote that tweet for him. I have no basis to say that. I have no sources on that, but it's literally coming from an agent, and if it wasn't written by an agent, it was dictated by one. That is something an agent says to him, and a little hashtag strap Harris in there, that's a nice little touch there.
So we have that, and then on Monday, Vic Fangio was forced to address a question that had to do with the raised voices and argumentative style of yelling that assembled media heard in the locker room after the game. I don't know exactly what happened, if people were getting after each other or, there might be some finger pointing, some accountability issues going on there. But Zach, it wouldn't surprise me to learn that Chris Harris Jr. might have been somehow involved in that.
Yeah, and he's gotten worse, I think, the last couple of years, and he's relying really on his reputation and his Pro Bowls and his All-Pro status, what he had in the past. He is not the same corner. But what concerned me is right after he got his money, his little 2019 bonus in the form of $3.5 million, he literally came out right after and said, "I want to be the number one corner." It had no appreciation or gratitude for what Denver just did for him. He was already looking for his next payday and probably his next team. So the fact that he would come out and say 13 more weeks, it's the least bit surprising to me. He is one of those mercenaries in that locker room, maybe just like Emmanuel Sanders on offense, like some of these other guys, Derek Wolfe, guys who know they don't have a long-term future in Denver, and they're literally, and we talked about it on the pod yesterday, going through the motions now. It's all about evaluation. Whether the Broncos admit it or not, emotionally, they're going to turn the page to 2020 soon, and the locker room is going to check out, and they're all going to just collect their paychecks and try to stay healthy. And that's what you're seeing Chris Harris Jr. And nothing tears a locker apart, like losing. And the Broncos just can't win. They literally cannot win. And you're starting to see the fractures now. It won't be long before it bleeds over into the coaching staff, and you have a whole mess on your hands.
Well, we still got a lot more to get to in the Aftermath episode today for you, our awesome listeners of the Huddle Up podcast. But first, we got to take a quick break, our only break of the day. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, I want to touch on an article. And by the way, just referencing our previous conversation with regard to Bradley Chubb, Dakota Watson is still available as a free agent, so don't be shocked if the Broncos go back to the well and bring him back, because at least he has some veteran experience. The team could rely on him. So keep that as a feather in the cap. We'll see if that happens this week. If it does happen, it will be this week. But I want to draw your attention to an article that Eric Trickle published on Monday, 8 veterans whom the Broncos should consider offers on the trading block before the deadline. And I want to go through each one of these and tell me if you think these are candidates the Broncos should strongly consider moving and just kind of get what they could get and stockpile some picks, or if they are the type of player that belongs here with the core. All right? Let me start with Todd Davis. This is a guy that Trickle listed because his first game back, he appeared to be a significant upgrade for the team in terms of stopping the run. But he, just like everyone else on that defense in Week 4 against the Jags, was exposed, liability, sloppy, filling the wrong gaps, missing tackles. Is Todd Davis, if you can get any kind of value for Todd Davis, and it would probably be of the late round variety in terms of compensation, is that a player with the way this team is currently constructed that you would consider offers for if you're the Broncos?
Chad, there's like 4 or 5 players that I would consider semi-untouchable in the Denver locker room, and Todd Davis is the furthest thing from that. I don't think he has any trade value, but if they can get a 7th-round pick or a bag of footballs, it doesn't matter. I would take that and run. He's a liability still. He's a plain 2-down run-stuffing linebacker, and even now in the game, he keeps blowing angles, taking bad routes to the edge. He's not a great football player, and we're starting to see him being exposed again like he was the last couple of years. If they can trade him, that'd be great. I just think he's a guy that's going to be cut probably next offseason.
I think it's just one of those positions where the Broncos have to accept the fact that they are not on a level at off-ball linebacker. Todd Davis is not going to be the difference between this team winning and losing games. And so get Keyshawn Bierria, get Alexander Johnson, get those guys reps. Even Justin Hollins, start working him in as the season progresses. I mean, obviously, he proved himself, as I mentioned earlier in the show, to be not quite ready for the amount of snaps he was given in Week 4, but he's a player you believe in. Maybe you now repurpose him strictly for the edge with what happened to Bradley Chubb. But either way, you have some young talent there at the off-ball linebacker position that the team, frankly, still doesn't really know much about. And even Keyshawn Bierria, you cut him, you brought him back for a reason. He's a former draft pick. Alexander Johnson is a guy that you consider to be like a 3rd, 4th round caliber player that you got as an undrafted rookie because of his off-field legal problems. Neither of these guys have seen significant reps yet because it's all gone to Josie Jewell, Corey Nelson, Todd Davis. You move Todd Davis, take him out of the equation. Eventually, Josie Jewell is going to be healed up and good to go, and he can return as one of the 2 starters on the defense. But then maybe you're giving Alexander Johnson another look, and then that way you know for sure, one way or another, whether or not off-ball linebacker needs to be one of those priority draft picks in your first 2 rounds next year.
I hate to say it, but if the Broncos are going to lose games this year, if it's not going to matter either way in the standings, I'd rather the Broncos lose by playing their young players than by playing the Todd Davises of the world. Like I said, it's all about evaluation at this point. It's all about turning the page to 2020, and you have to know at inside linebacker, considering you really neglected that spot this offseason, what you have going forward. Can Bierria, Alexander Johnson, Joe Jones, Hollins, can those players be core players of the future? Can they be replacements for Todd Davis or not? And you have to go out and get some guy in the open market or draft him. They have to figure those decisions out. And one of those main spots is an inside linebacker. But for my money, Todd Davis doesn't have any trade value, and the day that he's released by Denver, they move on, will be a much better day for this Broncos team.
I just can't believe how bad this defense has been with the amount of talent that they've had. I mean, seriously. I mean, we might have undersold how talented the Broncos were on the defensive side of the ball, but just by virtue of Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, by virtue of Chris Harris Jr., by virtue of Kareem Jackson, by virtue of the Justin Simmons upside, by virtue of Derek Wolfe's experience, at least as a run stopper, and then you tie in Vic Fangio's X's and O's acumen. I cannot believe how badly Fangio's scheme has been exposed so far.
And what it says to me is that it's affecting every single player. If it was just one guy, you can say, oh, maybe it's that guy not taking to the scheme. But it's every single player on that defense. No one is playing overly well. So you have to point the finger to Fangio and say maybe his scheme as a whole, what he's installed and what he kind of got rid of from the Wade Phillips era, and I hate to say it, the Joe Woods era, that was the mistake. And it's backfiring in his face, epically bad right now.
All right, let's move on to the next guy on Trickle's list here, Jeff Heuerman. Heuerman, to me, has been a complete and utter dud in terms of one of the veteran holdovers that the Broncos chose to re-sign and bring back. I understand at the time why they did it, but he has been, the value he's presented to the team through the first quarter of this season has been next to none. Meanwhile, Noah Fant is increasingly ascending, scored his first touchdown in Week 4. Your former, a 6th-round pick, Troy Fumagalli, didn't even dress again in Week 4. Andrew Beck's still on this roster. Do you really need Jeff Heuerman? I don't think so. If you could get a song for Jeff Heuerman, I think he's a guy that you move, but I can't imagine there's going to be much interest out there, if any, for him, unless it's maybe Gary Kubiak.
Right, yeah, he's like a Todd Davis. Davis might even have more trade value than Hireman. He has none. Another guy, when the Broncos finally turn the page and admit their mistake on him, they will be a better football team. Noah Fant, it looks like the light's finally going on in a sense. We have to hope he continues ascending because he has Pro Bowl upside. He has upside that Hireman can only dream about. So not a guy you keep and not a guy you can really trade, a guy you move on from in the offseason.
I just love the way Noah Fant is, his intensity as a blocker. You know, he kind of made the Garrett Bowles mistake in that pancake block that got him busted for holding on Sunday against the Jaguars. But you can't always take your man to the ground and pancake him, especially if it's at the point of attack, because more often than not, the ref's going to see that and just throw the flag. But I still like the intensity. I love that he's showing that physicality, because the book on him coming into the draft, of course, was he's all finesse. He's one of these athletic pass catchers. He's a big basketball player playing football. No, he's not. He's a football player. All right, let's move on to the next one here. Shelby Harris, Zach. Let me quote what Trickle says here. Denver is misusing Harris. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He is not a nose tackle and will never be one. If the Broncos are going to continue to use him as such, they'd be better off moving him. It isn't fair to use him where he can't be the player he is, especially in a contract year. This makes me think he isn't in their plans beyond this year, and if that's the case, it's all the more reason to move Shelby Harris. Close quote from Eric Trickle there. Your thoughts?
I mean, I've always been a Shelby Harris fan, and I think if you use him correctly, he can be a very dominant player for you like we saw the last couple of years. But the Broncos, I agree with Eric. They are misusing him badly right now at nose tackle. It's not his strength. It's taking away his biggest strength, which is getting to the passer. He is not a run-stuffing nose tackle. We talked about it on the pod yesterday after the game. They have Mike Purcell. That's a run-stuffer. Activate him and kick out Harris to one of the end spots. I think you'll see a better result there. He's a guy, if I had him my way, I would extend him or lock him down and keep him a part of the future. Because if you use him correctly, and I don't know what Fangio is thinking, I don't know if he'll ever even see him as a starting defensive end, but if you do, I think you can get much better production than wasting him a nose tackle right now. That's just my 2 cents on Shelby Harris.
Make him a 3 technique. Yep. Make him contend with tackles more than he has to contend at the point of attack, because as Trickle pointed out in a different article, I think it was in his grades breakdown, the Jaguars, opponents have zeroed in and singled out Shelby Harris, that he can't handle the power attack there and hold the point. And until the Broncos make an adjustment, I mean, that's just another misjudgment by the Denver Broncos to not dress Mike Purcell knowing that you are going against a Jacksonville Jaguars team whose sole purpose on a game-in, game-out basis is to run the power game. And you have arguably the best power back in the NFL in Leonard Fournette, and you choose to sit your one run-stuffing nose tackle. That, to me, is just another head-scratching decision by this coaching staff.
All comes down to coaching, and then Fournette goes on to have a career day against the Broncos defense on the road. It's just you make those little mistakes. You don't think about the players you declare inactive. I usually agree with Fangio on those kind of moves. I don't really harp on these kind of things, but to sit a predominant run stuffer against a run-first team, I will never understand why I did that.
All right, let's move on to the next guy here, Justin Simmons. Now, you and I, Zach, have lamented his inability to make a clear impact outside of, I can think of 3 plays right now through the first 4 quarters or 4 games of the first quarter of this season in which I noticed Justin Simmons doing something that impacted the game in a positive way. It's been more of, and I'll quote Eric Trickle here, he's making the same mistakes but makes a play or two here and there that make everyone forget about the negatives. Justin Simmons is in a contract year. He was supposed to be one of these young core players that the team can kind of build around on the defensive side. But honestly, Zach, he's played more like a Jag, right? He's played more like just a guy that is replacement level. You could find someone who can probably day one in the 3rd or 4th round of the draft perform at a similar level than you're getting from Justin Simmons right now. So if you can move him in a contract year, to me, I'm listening to offers.
Yeah, I'm mostly with you on that. I'm a pretty big Justin Simmons fan, but if you can get a mid-round pick for him and maybe move on, I would consider it. Though I will say it's crazy because he looks so good in the summer. He looks so good in training camp, so good in the preseason. He had an interception almost every other practice, and then once the lights went on, he just became invisible. And that's another sign of coaching because the entire team did that. They withered when the game started counting. He's a guy that has a lot of playmaking potential. He's rangy, he's fast, he's instinctual. If you can harness all that, You have a Pro Bowl safety. The problem is Fangio hasn't been able to harness that. Gun in my head, I would extend Justin Simmons, try to keep him around, but he's not untouchable, and a trade, I wouldn't rule it out if it was considered or floated out there.
All right, next guy, and to me this kind of falls similarly into the same bucket as Jeff Heuerman, but that's Devontae Booker. And he's seen basically 0 snaps on offense. His only utility to the team is depth and kick returner who's going to get the ball right to the 20 every time. You might as well have taken the touchback. I don't understand why they have remained so adamant with Devontae Booker as the kick returner. Why aren't you utilizing Deontay Spencer there and put some twitch and explosion? Give yourself a weapon in that return game. Devontae Booker, I mean, I guess he can hold on to the ball, but if he's going to be your kick returner, Zach, you might as well just hope and pray each and every kick is a touchback.
Another Elway draft pick the team is forcing to play out there. I agree with you. He doesn't do anything exciting. The fact that he holds on to the ball, I guess, is a positive. And the only thing I could think about with Spencer is the Broncos are afraid of risking him to injury because they've waited so long to find a capable punt returner. They don't want to lose him now. I don't really get what they're doing with Booker, though he has no trade value either. He's a guy they'll probably move on from, in a contract year.
Yeah.
Good, decent running back to have, but he does nothing to move the needle in the backfield or on special teams. So pretty unremarkable guy.
I have a hard time seeing a team out there really asking about Booker. However, Trickle did bring up one point, and that is if there's a playoff contending team out there, similar to what C.J. Anderson provided the L.A. Rams late last year, that you need a veteran that can come in and, pound the rock for you between the tackles, I could see someone be interested. But what can you expect? A conditional seventh round pick, maybe, if that, for Devontae Booker. So these last 3, Zach, I'm going to serve them to you as a trio. They are each holdovers from the Super Bowl 50 World Championship, and they are Derek Wolfe, Emmanuel Sanders, and Chris Harris Jr. Of these 3 players, is there anyone that is, as you said earlier in our conversation, among the untouchables?
No. I mean, Derek Wolfe, he's a great locker room guy, great fan favorite, but he cannot stay on the field, and he's getting up there in age. He's replaceable. Emmanuel Sanders coming off an injury, he still looks pretty good, but he's also among the mercenary type of vibe like Chris Harris Jr. They can get what they get out of him for now as the burner type, but they'll replace him in the offseason. Chris Harris Jr., we talked about, I mean, he wants to be highly paid. He literally already said he can't wait to get out of Denver. He's not coming back. None of these guys, Chad, they're not, they're in their 30s. They're not, long-term guys. They're not untouchable, irreplaceable guys.
Of that trio, the only one I would be a little bit reluctant to get rid of, and maybe this is the sentimental side of me coming out here, is Derek Wolfe. Even though of the 3, he's probably the least impactful guy right now, but that's not why I'm saying it. The reason I'm saying it is because I think the Broncos could use, similarly to Von Miller, one of the guys who was there and contributed significantly to Super Bowl 50, who is good for the locker room culture, who fancies himself a lifelong Bronco. We know Derek Wolfe has stood up multiple times and said he wants to retire Bronco, doesn't ever envision himself playing anywhere but Denver. And when he says it, Zach, I believe it. It sounds, to me, it comes off as everything, it's completely sincere. Let me just put it that way. Meanwhile, we've heard guys like Sanders and Harris say similar things, but you don't really believe that they actually mean that. It's more like talking points, platitudes, doing a little PR, saying what everyone expects them to say. Meanwhile, Derek Wolfe to me is a true ride or die Bronco, and I think you can keep him around beyond this year on the relative cheap. I think he's having to face facts with the reality of this season for him as well, that if he still has these designs of being able to hit the market next year and just crush it, it's not going to happen. He might be able to find a 1-year, $4 or $5 million deal, but if the Broncos are willing to give him 2 more years to stay in Denver and give him $7-8 million for his troubles, why leave Denver?
And Derek Wolfe is the type of guy, you know this as well as I do. He's going to go on and sign like a 1-year incentive-laden contract with like the Patriots and win a Super Bowl and then go out on top. That's just the type of player that he can be at this stage. He's a backup, sub-starter type player. That's what he is. He can't stay healthy, getting up there in age. He's never been overly dominant as a pass rusher. Pretty good against the run. I agree with you that he's more emotionally invested in this team than Sanders and Chris Harris Jr., but still, it's all about production. He knows better than anyone. If you don't produce, you're not going to be around. And his whole, don't even F with us mentality, that flew in 2015 when they had a Super Bowl and they had a dominant defense, but now it's hollow. Now their defense is a joke. So what does he really offer other than a good quote, other than a good soundbite in the locker room, you have to produce. And I think they'll replace him with a better player, and it could be Draymond Jones or DeMarcus Walker even next year.
That's what's so alarming to me, man. I mean, you use the J word to describe this defense, and even Vance Joseph, all right, when he, obviously Joe was defensive coordinator during the 2 years Vance Joseph was in Denver, there were a couple of times in which Joe Woods was getting worked over by the opponent, and Vance Joseph had to step in at halftime, and we learned after the fact that he called the plays in the second half, and the defense played at a much higher level, more on point, more focused, more disciplined, more effective from an execution standpoint. How is it, and I'm really struggling here, you guys, how is it that a coach that we have all perceived as being completely out of his league and overwhelmed, like Vance Joseph, has seemed more with it from an X's and O's perspective than Vic Fangio? I don't recall, Zach, from a adjustment perspective, seeing a Vance Joseph coach defense completely come undone in those clutch moments like the Broncos did in Week 2 and Week 4. Game in hand, all you need is your defense to get one stop. Vance Joseph's units, I can't remember them ever in those situations. They were always, when they lost, they were getting blown out. In those games in which they were in it, those were the games they typically found a way to win late. Why can't they do this? Why can't Vic Fangio get over the hump here? This is, to me, I'm completely stunned with the direction this thing has spun.
In the second half of games, it looks like the Broncos defense is just worn out. They have no fire, no intensity. Any swagger they had in the first half is gone by the fourth quarter. The only thing I can think of is that Vance ran a really relaxed environment in Dove Valley, light practices, a lot of walkthroughs, whereas Vic Fangio, all he did in training camp was have them in pads almost every practice. They had 5 preseason games. I'm starting to wonder, are they tired? Are they beat up? Are they physically just, out of it, overwhelmed right now? That's the only thing I can point to. Or the fact that Vic Fangio's scheme is not good, or they haven't bought into his message, or both. Either way, in any scenario, it all comes back to the coach. And when you consider, you make that point, which is very valid, that a Vance Joseph defense is better than a Vic Fangio defense, it literally numbs my mind, Chad.
And for what it's worth, I'm not saying Vance Joseph is a better defensive coordinator than Vic Fangio. I just think there's been a comedy of factors that have led to this situation, and I'm just frankly stunned that Vic Fangio's expertise on that side of the ball has been completely impotent in the face of it. I'm really stunned, and I can only imagine, Zach, the type of conversations that are taking place between John Elway, Matt Russell, and Joe Ellis at this point. Like, what the heck's going on here? Like, I understand, Vic, that maybe there's all these new faces and moving parts, a new quarterback, 2 different systems being installed and learned this year, a really long training camp, a really long preseason, injuries to boot to key players and free agent acquisitions we expected to play a big role on these teams. We understand all these these factors, but frankly, we expected more from an execution perspective just based on your wherewithal, experience, expertise as a defensive coach. Like, this is completely off the reservation.
Yeah, I'm not willing to crucify Fangio after 4 games, but it's definitely not what the Broncos thought they were going to get. And you start to wonder, is this why he took so long to get a head coaching offer? Is this why he was a lifelong assistant, a lifelong coordinator? He never was good enough to make the leap. What's more concerning to me lately off the field is he's handling the media with the same comedy shtick as Vance Joseph, giving non-answers, cliches, skirting around questions. I want to see some of that accountability that he preached all offseason. It's gone now. They're in a losing streak. I want to see that come out through adversity, not when it's March or April and you can say whatever you want. Everyone's 0-0. Now you're 0-4. How will you respond? And every single week, he's had no clue. It just seems like it's getting worse before it gets a lot better.
Hey, I'm still going to try and keep the faith a little bit with Vic Fangio and believe that this quarter is a little bit of an outlier, this quarter of the season, and that he still can turn this thing around. But I'm not expecting any miracles. Don't get me wrong. I just think that this defense is capable of playing a lot better with the talent it has than we've seen from them at certain points. I mean, there have been stretches where this defense has played very well under Vic Fangio, but it's in these key moments. And that's what another thing that's so frustrating is they repped and practiced and made that such a focus, situational football, during training camp, during OTAs, and to see them unravel and come unglued in those key situations now that the games are here is just all the more puzzling. But you guys, that's going to do it for today. Zach and I will be back in the saddle for you on Thursday. We'll look ahead, see what we can do to maybe get a Chargers writer on the horn for that. If not, we'll have some good look-ahead content for you for the LA Chargers next week. But in the meantime, you're going to have a fresh episode of Building the Broncos on Wednesday to look forward to, so stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, make sure you're following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. You can find my partner, Zack Kelberman, on Twitter at KelbermanNFL. Myself, at Chad and Jensen. Keep your chin up, Broncos country. I know right now it feels like this team has completely gone off the rails, but hey, it can't get much worse. So just focus on these young players and try and get some enjoyment out of what you're seeing from Noah Fant, what you're seeing from Cortland Sutton, Phillip Lindsay. We'll see if Fangio if he can turn the ship. We'll see. I don't expect him to turn the ship in terms of really trying to get back into any kind of a playoff hunt, but get back to some form of respectability and competitiveness against at least these AFC West opponents, and he'll get another shot at an AFC opponent this coming week. So keep your chin up. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you on Thursday.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.